I am Jenny Stamp, Associate Director of Public Engagement and Science Learning at the Bell Museum. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight. We're happy to be hosting the panel discussion, University Tribal Partnerships to Support Sovereignty and Environmental Justice. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the events of the week here in the Twin Cities. As you all surely know, whether you're joining us from nearby or far away, Daunte Wright, a 20-year-old Black man, was killed by police in a traffic stop on Sunday night. This senseless loss took place as the trial of Derek Chauvin and the killing of George Floyd unfolds here in Minneapolis. People on the street protesting these acts of violence are being met with further violence. There's a lot of grief, anger, and frustration in our community at this time. And there's clearly a lot of work to be done on racial equity. At the Bell, we are committed to that work and to bringing together conversations like this one that can help us understand our past and build sound, equitable relationships for the future. So this is not a time for business as usual by any means, but it is a time for doing the work. And we see holding this panel tonight as crucial to that work. That said, I'd like to let the audience know that we will be making a recording of this discussion and it will be available on our website next week. I hope you'll be able to stay with us tonight, but if not, please catch up with us later and please take care of yourselves. In moving on to tonight's topic, tribal sovereignty and partnership, I want to also acknowledge that, like the rest of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, the Bell Museum sits on the traditional and treaty lands of the Dakota people, lands that were expropriated despite being reserved in treaties in 1805, 1837, and 1851. The Bell Museum serves all communities across the state, and so I'd also like to acknowledge the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people, indigenous keepers of lands to the north, lands likewise taken despite treaties reserving them and their use to Ojibwe people. At the Bell, we recognize this history of dispossession and our place in it as the state's Natural History Museum and as a unit of the university. We understand indigenous knowledge systems as crucial ways of knowing this place now called Minnesota. Those systems are embedded in language, community, and cultural practice. We honor indigenous knowledge and the frameworks that support it. We stand with indigenous knowledge keepers and follow their lead. We seek to understand the past and to acknowledge the violence and error in that past, and we are committed to building respectful relations in projects that serve indigenous peoples. Tonight's conversation is in support of our current temporary exhibition, Climates of Inequality. This exhibition centers community stories of environmental justice in search of racial and social equity. Environmental justice concerns itself with the people who are often left out of environmental conservation, particularly Black and Indigenous peoples, people of color, and people experiencing poverty. This exhibit comes to us from the Humanities Action Lab, an international coalition of students, educators, and community leaders that produces projects on urgent social matters, including now environmental justice. As part of this coalition, students and faculty at the University of Minnesota have worked with community partners to understand what environmental justice looks like here. The exhibition foregrounds storytelling and local experience. One of the featured stories explores legislation passed by the White Earth Band of Ojibwe to enshrine the rights of Manoomin, or wild rice, rights that are akin to the rights held by people and crucially by corporations. Tonight's discussion picks up on that concern with centering wild rice and indigenous ways of knowing, protecting, and respecting it. Our moderator tonight is Dr. Mike Dockry. Mike is a member of the citizen Potawatomi Nation, which holds traditional territories around Lake Michigan and contemporary tribal lands in central Oklahoma. Mike is an assistant professor for tribal natural resource management in the Department of Forest Resources at the University of Minnesota and an affiliate faculty member of the American Indian Studies Department. Mike holds a BS in Forest Science from the University of Wisconsin, an MS in Forest Resources from Penn State, and a PhD in forestry from the University of Wisconsin. He enjoys canoeing, biking, and being with his family. Mike's research and teaching focus on tribal natural resource management, climate adaptation planning, environmental history, incorporating Indigenous knowledge into forestry and building partnerships with American Indian tribes. His research supports tribal sovereignty. He's currently involved in a large tribally directed research project to protect and restore Manoomin in the Great Lakes, along with several of our panelists. Before I turn it over to Mike, I have a few notes for the audience. We will hold some time for your questions to the panelists. Please post those and any comments to the Q&A feature in Zoom. Our backstage team will help you get answers. As you've noticed, we have captioning turned on for our program this evening. If you don't want to see these captions, you can hide them by clicking the Live CC button at the bottom of your screen. And my apologies, we're relying on Zoom for captions this time around, so please bear with us. Lastly, Thomas Howes, Natural Resource Program Manager for the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, was unable to join us tonight. But Rico has signed on to join us on very short notice, and we appreciate that. Mike, thank you so much for being here and for bringing this discussion together. I'll hand it over to you to introduce our guests and to get the discussion started.
Great, Miigwech, thank you very much. Bonjour, denwe makanak, kwabmat indigenikas. I'm Mike Dockry, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you tonight. As Jennifer said, I'm a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and have done a lot of work with some of the people you have on this, we have on this panel around wild rice protection and restoration. But more than that, we're really trying to elevate tribal voices, tribal research needs, understanding that those voices have not always been listened to or heard by the University of Minnesota and other universities. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means tonight. So I'm happy that you're all here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of introduce everyone so you know who we're talking with tonight. Then they will introduce themselves. I have a few questions that we've already, that we'll talk about over the next, I guess, a little bit less than an hour or so. And then for the last half an hour, I'd love to have questions from all of you that are attending. And I see that there are quite a few. And as I saw everybody coming in, I can't see right now on my screen, but it's really exciting to have, you know, almost 100 people together tonight. So thank you so much. So I'll just introduce everyone in turn, and then we'll get started. So first of all, I'm happy to introduce my friend and colleague, Mark Belcourt. Mark is from the White Earth Nation, and he was one of the co-PIs of our project, the Kawegada Nana Gada Wendamin Manoomin, the first we must consider Manoomin project that we'll talk about. Mark is retired at this point, but he was an academic professional here at the University of Minnesota, advising students and teaching classes for almost 20 years. So it really is a pleasure to be back with Mark again. He's a former board member from the American Indian Science and Engineering Society, and I know he's still very engaged with that organization. And like I said, he's an enrolled member of the White Earth Nation. Our next panelist that I'll introduce is Crystal Ng, also a friend and colleague here. Crystal is an associate professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences here at the University of Minnesota. Crystal is, Dr. Ng is a hydrologist whose research focuses on how water interacts with soil, the atmosphere, plants, and biochemistry. And particularly, she's looking at the response to stressors such as climate change, land use and land cover change, and contamination. Through the collaborative Tribal University project on Manoomin, she has had the honor of learning from tribal partners as they work together to protect Manoomin and support tribal sovereignty. And Crystal is the co-leader of this project with me. Crystal really started it off and has graciously brought me into the fold over the years. Next, I would like to introduce Tiana Odegaard. Tiana is an independent public historian. She's a member of the Upper Sioux community, one of the 4 federally recognized Dakota tribes here in Minnesota. She earned her master's in heritage studies and public history at the University of Minnesota. She hopes to continue engaging with the public with a range of diverse backgrounds, and really to take note of the history of the people and the lands we are all surrounded by, privileging life experiences and knowledge sets that are not traditionally validated by academic settings. Tiana was also one of the students, I believe, that helped put this Climate of Inequalities exhibit together. So it's my pleasure to get to know you as we prepared for this and to welcome you onto the panel today. Finally, Chris Rico is a graduate student, a current graduate student here at the University of Minnesota in public history and heritage studies. Chris focused on conducting community-centered and driven environmental justice research and awareness initiatives. He had the privilege of first starting this work by contributing to the project that Crystal and I are leading, that Mark was early on instrumental in getting started, the Rights of Manoomin project. And he helped bring the Rights of Manoomin into the Climates of Inequality exhibit. He went on to research the legacy of the university's wild rice breeding and genetics program in support of the work I did. Sorry, I messed that up a little bit, Chris. But thank you so much for being here. I was the undergraduate honors thesis co-advisor for Chris. So I know Chris pretty well as well. So I thank all of you for being here with us tonight. And without me talking anymore, I'd like to sort of turn it over to all of you. And maybe we can just go in the order that I introduced everyone to start off, and then we'll have a discussion here. But I'd like you to take a few minutes to introduce yourself, particularly focusing in on how the work that you're doing interacts with wild rice, climate change, and or environmental justice or environmental inequality. So Mark, we can start with you.
Miigwech, Mike. Bonjour, Mark Belcourt, Nin Indigenous Shani Yashimang Bimose and Adash Indigo Jibaway Mung. Gawini Kamasian Dudame, Awaba Banika, Nin and Dunjaba, Shikbut, Ashkibug Zipping. Greetings all. My Ojibwe name is Walking Man, and my English name is Mark Belcourt. I come from the White Earth Reservation, but I live in White Earth, or in St. Paul nowadays. I'd like to maybe just kind of throw out there when we talk about like the sustainability and things, that I think one of the important differences that we'll find historically is that when we look at the languages, that most of the Western European languages are verb-based or noun-based languages. So we think about the world in things of tangible items. Whereas if you think about most indigenous languages, we are verb-based languages. So we see the world in terms of action. So what is happening, and not necessarily what can we get out of Mother Earth, but instead what is happening to Mother Earth and how do we coexist with Mother Earth.
Which Mark?
All right, so I guess it's my turn. So hello, thank you for having me. So once again, I'm Crystal Ng, and I guess I want to actually just start off with saying that maybe in some ways a bit of an odd one out on this panel. I am a Chinese American conventionally trained academic scientist, specifically a hydrologist. And what I mean by conventionally trained is, I went to college and grad school, got more training as a postdoc, always under other conventionally trained hydrologists. And so until really recently, most of what I understood about water and the environment, I learned within the walls of academic institutions, and always from those with really the same kinds of background. And so I actually just want to say that as a conventionally trained scientist, I first just want to mention how I first saw my work with wild rice, with Manoomin, intersecting with environmental justice. I really first became interested in wild rice when I first was hearing about the heated debates going on around Minnesota's water quality standard about sulfate for protecting wild rice. So for those of you who are not familiar with this, mining companies and other industries that really release elevated concentrations of sulfate with their discharge waters were pushing back on the standard. And in fact, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has never once enforced this water quality standard. And so to me, this is a matter of environmental justice. tribes' access to wild rice is legally protected by treaties signed by the federal government. And so I became interested in researching, better understanding that connection between sulfate and water. And this was really the kind of research that intrigued me, all these complex interactions in the environment. And, I got to say, it also just felt really good that, through my research, I could be doing something for tribes by clarifying that connection. But I want to actually just say right now that when I'm honest with myself, when I started out, I think that my approach to environmental justice is really a scientist-centric one. It was really about the research I wanted to do. And I was the one who was doing something good about helping out marginalized communities. And I have to also say that I suspect that my perspective then might not be so different than other conventionally trained scientists. And the work that I've just had the honor of being part of these last 3 years with Mark, with Mike, and with others, on this collaborative project has completely transformed how I approach thinking about doing work with environmental justice. And that's because this collaborative project that I'm involved in really does center tribes and their perspective on wild rice. And that's really the meaning behind our project name, that first we must consider Manoomin and the people for whom Manoomin is sacred. And it's not researchers who should be at the center. And by centering tribes, I've realized that, sulfate is important, but it's, they've really pointed out just how short-sighted I can be about just all the different stressors that could be affecting Manoomin, including climate change. And, and centering tribes has meant that in thinking about environmental justice, what's important is not what I think justice looks like, it's what tribes think justice looks like. And finally, the way that I feel like, we do come in as scientists is thinking actually really critically about our positions and maybe what roles we've played in terms of perpetrating injustices, in terms of ignoring and marginalizing tribal perspectives, and the research that sometimes we as scientists do when we ignore the implications for tribes. And so I just want to say that I really thank the others on this panel for helping me realize this, and hopefully, supporting doing work as researchers that can support tribal sovereignty. Thanks.
Which that was great. Thank you, Crystal. Tiana, if you'd like to introduce yourself, please.
Yapi Chante Washte na page use up PA, Wishichuya Tiana Odegaard, Makia PA, Pijutizizi, Edwati Kla Hamata Haye. I said, hello, all my friends and relatives. I greet you with a handshake from the heart. My name is Tiana Odegaard, and I live at and come from the land where they dig for yellow medicine, more commonly known today as Upper Sioux Community. And I am just beyond grateful to be here with you all today to discuss our relative wild rice. And so my perspective that I bring here today is not representative of my entire community, but of my own opinions and thoughts, influenced by my graduate school experience, but also from communities surrounding the Dakotas and Anishinaabe Ojibwe nations. And so all of our knowledge keepers coming together and the science coming together, I believe, is just one of the most beautiful things in the process of learning from one another and then coming together to see what we can do to disseminate, educate, and advocate for the protections and treaty rights and continued collaboration and partnership. So I'm just very honored to have participated during the program. At this time last year, I was in a course called Environmental Justice and Public Memory, taught by Kevin Murphy and Chris Taylor. And I took the course because of the partnership with the Bell Museum and Humanities Action Lab, knowing that I was participating with my group and fellow classmates in a project that wasn't just for college and grade sake, but actually had an impact and was going to be for public consumption, and the goal to have collective community input is just so beautiful to see. It's hard to see a year ago how this would frame out and be today, but just to be here with you all and to share and learn, I am just beyond grateful. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Chris.
Hey everyone, I'm Chris. I'm a white settler here from Minnesota. As you know, or as you heard from Mike, I've engaged. I started engaging in this kind of work in the kind of precursor to the class that Tiana was just talking about, where we did some programming development and exhibit development for the climates of inequality here today. And that really got my, that's where I really got my start kind of in working with tribal communities and issues of tribal sovereignty and climate justice. And since then, I've really focused my my studies and kind of my research and my contributions in those areas. Most recently, as Mike mentioned, I completed a thesis on the university's legacy of wild rice breeding and genetics research, and how the approach to that research, the initial approach to that research led to a lot of problems in the early 2000s in coming out with genetic research and violating treaty rights and tribal sovereignty. Currently, I'm looking to start researching issues related to damming impacts faced by Indigenous communities. Specifically, right now, I'm looking at impacts faced by the historical damming of the Mississippi headwaters in the 1880s, how that affected the Leech Lake tribe. And I'm hoping to, kind of bring in or see how issues or concepts of wastelanding, if that's a concept some of you might be familiar with, coined by Tracy Voiles, paternalism and lack of cultural competency, how these kind of intersections come together to create the kinds of problems that we see with, or that have historically characterized kind of university tribal relationships, and as well as what I saw in my own research with the university's legacy of wild rice research and working with tribal communities. So I'm very happy to be here speaking with you guys today. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. This is great. So I'm going to go through a series of questions, and I'm going to throw a curveball because this is one I just came up with as you were all introducing yourselves and talking about the projects. But it really dawned upon me that, again, as you were all talking, I start hearing really loud and clear that bringing in tribal voices into what you're doing, whether it's history, whether it's science and hydrology, whether it's teaching, that bringing in those voices has really been both transformational for all of you, but for those disciplines themselves. So I wonder if you could just reflect upon the transformation. Maybe we can start with Crystal. I'll just throw this out there. How you mentioned transforming sort of how you saw science through these partnerships. And then we can just kind of popcorn and unmute. Feel free to unmute yourselves.
Yeah, sure. So I feel very, very strongly about this. So thanks for the question, Mike. I'm a hydrologist, but I've always considered myself to be an integrated hydrologist because I'm interested in how water connects with all the other things, the atmosphere, plants, biogeochemistry. And so I thought I was kind of maybe an expert at thinking about how water interfaces with other things. And my participation in this collaborative project and working with tribal partners has completely opened my eyes to still just how narrowly it was always just kind of like looking just next door, maybe to the one discipline over, and still only those in that discipline who spoke the same kind of technical language as I did. And, on this project, I think a lot of the, I love the title of this project so much because what I'm learning is that Manoomin, wild rice, is teaching me really how to think about the way that things are connected, and really much more than just kind of what is that one next thing that's the easiest thing to connect. And that's because Manoomin is so sensitive to so many different aspects of the environment and people. So I think I always actually stop short of like, where could water really interact with people, because I'm such a physical scientist, and when we're trying to think about Manoomin protection and conservation, you don't get to pick what pieces of the environment you want to focus on. You have to think about it all together. And this is something that our tribal partners really impressed upon me early on. And so I actually just laugh at, my colleagues and I, where we thought we were really integrative. And when we talk about multidisciplinary, like, it's been just incredibly, just almost a different dimension of it. And that's been my experience. And I think that's just one of the reasons why I feel so grateful to be involved in this project and learning so much.
If I could just jump in for a moment too, for me, my dissertation when I was working on my doctorate was looking at how to include Indigenous knowledge into mainstream curriculums. And so for 25 years, I was sort of trying to go upstream at the University of Minnesota, which really valued that traditional science knowledge. And I engaged, many faculty in discussions, and it was difficult. It was a difficult conversation to have with them because they just didn't understand that there could be another view, that to most of the people that I dealt with were science is reality. You can touch it, you can feel it. And there wasn't that understanding that science is more. We go back, we look at, I mentioned the Indigenous languages before, but if you go back to the original meaning of the word science, it's Greek and Latin, meaning to seek knowledge. And when I talk with other folks from across the country and even the world, the Maoris in New Zealand and so on, that when they speak their native languages, when they talk about science, it literally translates back to seeking knowledge. So how is what we do different than what Western science is? And I think it just all is in the kind of view that Western science has this kind of concept. It's, like I said, it's very reductionistic, whereas Indigenous views are more holistic. And so it's kind of, so anyway, like I said, for 25 years, I've been sort of fighting with almost everybody at the university in trying to help them understand. And so when I met Crystal 3 years ago, working on this project, we had a lot of private conversations about, I don't want this just to be, namesake, and I wanted you to legitimately be interested in working with people and understanding that tribal sovereignty means allowing them to determine the agenda and not for us to tell them what the agenda should be. Thanks.
Yeah, and I can jump on as well. Crystal and Mark both touched on, I believe, what Chris and I will also touch on, but for me as a student in those spaces, when thinking about transforming, I found myself being put in the position that I had to translate academic phrasing into my own, what I grew up with. So when we talk about environmental justice, I'm like, okay, we're talking just about this, this, and this in this classroom, in this framework, but in what I know, it's more holistic, right? It's not reductionist. And so for me, I like to try to make sure that we can decolonize those categories and to make sure that we touch on everything in the environment. Like Crystal said, what can water impact? We can't just focus on one part of the environment. Making sure that if I'm the only Indigenous person, Native person in the room, that I make that space for my relatives and speak those truths, because a lot of them have fought for a seat at the table, and if they're missing, that voice needs to be there. So just making sure that, and even if it is a difficult conversation, like Mark said, just making sure that I empower those if they feel isolated, and to make sure that that translation exhaustion doesn't burn out, and that we have that continuous conversations, and that we're patient about others learning and our learning. And so that's something that's just been a true gift in these conversations. And that's my perspective, just being in a space of, it seems like a lot of education and translating and trying to make sure that we understand where each other's coming from. Building a partnership, collaboration from the beginning, making sure that it is framed from the tribe's perspective first, before coming at them with, here's what I'm going to focus on. And it's already in a flawed way of speaking, and it's not in the language that the tribe understands. And so just getting to a good space and going into the conversation with the best intentions and being open to what happens. But yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Krista, do you have anything to add, or?
Yeah, I can round us off a little bit. I think a lot of, when I got involved in this work and the things that this work deals with, the biggest takeaway for me, I consider myself still kind of new, or, I'm not very experienced, right? I've done, some work, but I still have a lot to learn. So a lot of what this work for me has done for me is it's made me more aware of, these environmental justice issues and things like that, that I feel like a lot of people maybe don't necessarily understand why, genetically modified wild rice isn't always, or how it could go against cultural values of Anishinaabe or Ojibwe or Dakota. And that, due to my positionality, it's that relationship I acknowledge is something that I can never, really fully grasp, but that doesn't mean that I can't try to understand and make myself more aware of these issues. And so getting on to a little bit of what Tiana was talking about, understanding and translating my position as a public historian to kind of act as somewhat of a mediator or what have you between these. Something that's come up before is like between these cultural issues and something like, some people in like Crystal's profession, like scientists and things like that. A lot of my work with the university's legacy of research is that a lot of people weren't making that effort to understand the cultural importance of Manoomin to these communities. And so that's really where a lot of the problems started with this legacy of research from the university, is not taking that extra step to center the community knowledge and do work for the community, not work, for yourself that involves the community. And that finally, I think, is another a big takeaway for me, like learning opportunity for me from all this work, is to it's really made me stop and think about why I want to, or why I am doing a certain project, and to compel myself to always make sure that I'm decentering myself and centering the communities that I'm working with.
Great, thank you. I'm going to answer one of the questions I see. I think there was a question about what does reductionism mean versus holistic, and I think of Western science has been sometimes defined as reductionist, breaking systems down to the smallest part and studying that, and then aggregating. The idea is that you can then aggregate to look at the whole. A holistic manner of doing science looks more at the relationships of the whole and how those all interact. And I think what we've heard, particularly from Mark and Tiana, is that an Indigenous worldview would be more towards the holistic, thinking about relationships going beyond relationships to start talking about responsibilities that we have to maintain relationships amongst ourselves as people, as well as with all of the other beings. So I just wanted to clarify that. We've been talking a little bit about these partnerships, right? This is all about university partnerships. I wonder, and a few ideas have come up already, but I'm going to ask, how do we build those partnerships? What are, if you were going to give somebody advice about building partnerships with tribes in the university or tribes in the state, what advice would you give them?
I can jump on, and I'm glad you asked. I wrote this down immediately, that don't have a timeline, and make sure that whatever you have imagined is down the road, possibly years in advance. Don't approach saying, hey, I want to have this project done by the end of the semester. I think the semesters have been pretty problematic, right? It's hard to really build that relationship when students or faculty are only able or approved to do so much in a time frame. And that also gets complicated for funding. Certain funds need to be spent within this time frame, but making sure that your strategic planning includes partnership building, listening sessions, that's before your actual project can start. And I know it's hard to define that. It's hard to fight for that and advocate for that. Some folks just see black and white on the paper. They don't see the relationship that needs to be founded in order for this project to be fully inclusive and representative of what the intention is. So timelines, I would say, is certainly the one, and to be consistent with the slow change. I know we're so fast paced, but to learn that patience and the sustainability, making sure that if you are a part of an institution, that you, I don't know, even create a handbook or some way of passing that information along to your the next person filling your role, and how the expectation is to respect these relationships.
So I think also the understanding that the sovereignty question. So I know when we first started this project, we actually participated with the White Earth Nation in going through their Human Subjects Review Committee. That just like a university, we had to go to that reservation, to their committee, and say, you know, because Manoomin is powerful. It's an entity, and we can't just go up and do what we want to it. So we went up there and we actually went through their whole review process, got denied, I think, the first couple of times before we finally got it right. And I think, you know, just listening to them, our first trip as a group, we went up there and met with the Elders Council, and I think Crystal can remember this too, where we just, you know, we went up there, we introduced ourselves and said, we just want to listen, and we just sat there, and the room was just quiet. And finally, one of the elders just asked, "Okay, fine, you want to listen to us, but what do you really want?" And we said, "We just want to listen." And again, we went silent, and it was uncomfortable for a long time. And finally, they started talking, and finally they started telling us some of the issues that they were having with the Manoomin, and that they would like us to, you know, help them find some answers. Thank you.
I hope you don't mind, but I'm just going to, before I answer this question, I just want to make a reference back to the previous question, because I think we were talking a lot about, just in terms of what was transformative, is learning a lot, and from tribes and from Indigenous peoples. And Mark mentioned, you know, kind of bringing in and valuing traditional ecological knowledge. But I guess I also wanted to mention that I do understand that there's always also the danger of appropriation of knowledge. And I think all of us have talked about respect, and that is central. And so I think when we talk about learning from tribes, I think at the same time we need to talk about and just make clear, I think everyone in this panel, it's very clear for us from the work that we do, but it's tribes' knowledge. It's not our knowledge, and it's what they choose to share with us. And whenever I give a presentation and there's any part of tribal knowledge included, I will always check with our tribal partners whether it's okay to present it. So I just realized that I think that didn't get mentioned for the last question. Yeah, but for this question in terms of building partnerships, I'd say probably two really key things, and I think they all kind of tie into what Tiana and Mark have already said. But one of them is, I think, humility. And I think this is really hard, and this is probably why Mark had a really hard time often, like having conventionally trained scientists, being able to recognize that there's another perspective, because I think we think that we are the experts, and we think that everyone should adhere to our timeline. And I think having that humility and being able to, accept when someone is telling you that it's not going to work your way. You have your worldview, and it doesn't always work when you want to work with someone else. And being able to say, you're right. You're right. Let me rethink that. You're right. I think that has been really critical in our project, and I think that's a really important element. And I think the other one is, and I think there's a lot of overlap here, but just really true commitment, and kind of a realization that, I think this goes with Tiana saying, like, kind of having that sustained relationship, but especially just given the history and just ongoing harms, I think that all of a sudden, sometimes some research projects might feel like, well, I wonder who are going to be the 3 people in the world who read this paper, because maybe that's the only thing that it matters for. I mean, this work that we're doing it's much greater than like my career, right? And so you need to be making that commitment that is commensurate with the work being done. And I think that's also another really critical part for the partnership building.
Yeah, so I'm gonna give a little context to some of what we're discussing here, just so we're all at least a little bit on the same page. And the project that Mark, Crystal, and I are involved in really comes out of tribes pleading with the university to work on issues that are important to their goals for wild rice protection and restoration. And that coming on some of the work that Chris has sort of uncovered, the tribes for many, many years now, decades, have told the university that they don't want research being done on their relative, Manoomin, wild rice, and that the university itself developing a cultivated wild rice strain, that's the dark one that you can buy in the grocery store. The stated, this comes out of the research that we've looked in the university archives, but the stated goals of the university is economic development, right? That the university, like the university has done with other crops, create a strain of crops that can be grown, sold into the market, and make profit and feed people. So that was the university's goal. Another goal that was part and parcel on this particular plant, the wild rice, was to develop cultivated wild rice that could be grown in a manner that would allow the tribes themselves to be economically, like, enter into that economic agriculture, right? We know the United States has a long history of trying to transform our tribal peoples into individual farmers, right? So this fits in with that. And we know the tactics that the United States and universities and schools used to achieve those goals. Boarding schools, for example, a lot of that was trying to get the young boys, teach them how to farm, right? The land dispossession across this country was related to this farming. And so the university's stated goals, if you look, it says we are going to help the tribes develop a crop that they can then use and make money, right? To enter into more of the United States economy. Well, the tribes never really benefited from that in the way that was stated through the university. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, when our work with genes, we started getting technologies to look at genes, to understand which genes are related to different characteristics. The Minnesota Chippewa tribe sent the university a letter, a very stern letter, saying that they should not be doing any work around genetics and wild rice, that is should be off limits, that wild rice, and I'm paraphrasing, is sovereign, is a sovereign being down to essentially the genes itself. And so there was well, the tribes were very vocal about not wanting the university to be doing this type of research, coupled with they weren't really the beneficiaries of the research like it was stated since I think the 50s, right, Chris? Yeah, 40s and 50s. So where are we? We're here, and people like Crystal, who has hydrological knowledge, the systems knowledge. We've got our public historians that have both cultural knowledge, but also knowledge on how to find information and present it. Mark as both cultural and kind of educator, science, integrating tribes into tribal knowledge into science. That's where this Manoomin project came to be, where we said, look, we have all these things. We have different knowledge sets. We have Native people on our team, myself and Mark. We've got we know that there are issues with the protection of rice. We've seen a decline in Michigan, and I'm going to get to my question here. So this is, get ready with your thinking about the ecological sort of impacts of climate change, et cetera, on wild rice. But we know that it's declined precipitously in Michigan, where my people are from, Potawatomi. In Wisconsin, it's declining. And in Minnesota, it's kind of hanging on, but there's a real worry that there's going to be major declines in this in wild rice habitat. So the tribal partners, when Mark is saying, you know, we got there and we just listened, it's like, what would you like us to be doing? How can we work together? And that, in a way, the way I approach research is research as service. I've been a public servant my entire life. And I see what I do as service, in this case, service to tribes. And you can't be of service if you don't understand what goals and objectives the people that you're serving have. So this humility, this listening, this understanding, that's all part of how I approach science for tribes. And that was where this project was born. And we've been going very strong for the past 3 or 4 years on this, to try to understand and tease apart the system a little bit, to see what's going on with the decline of wild rice and what can we do to prevent that from declining even further and restore it in places like Michigan, but also to protect it here in Minnesota, where it's growing strong still. So I'm going to ask you all, let's shift a little bit and maybe talk about the impacts that or the threats that wild rice is facing. So the impacts from climate change, could be other things, could be cultural changes as well.
I can start. I can start by just talking a bit about what we've been learning with our tribal partners. I think I kind of alluded to in my introduction. I try to pack in a lot. I think that I was thinking about it very narrowly, and then learning that Manoomin is declining across this pretty wide region that extends much farther than where mining impacts happen. So mining is an important threat in the northeastern part of Minnesota, but there's actually a lot of various threats going on. And I think one thing that's really difficult is that we might know various environmental stressors to which Manoomin is sensitive. This is, tribes who've been stewarding wild rice for generations have shared this with us. But actually in a lot of Manoomin lakes, it's been declining for reasons that actually aren't clear. And it's probably because it's various things that are slightly out of balance, that are slightly different now. And so because there's no one really glaring thing, it becomes very difficult to tell. And so actually, I mean, since I know that there's been some discussion of climate change, that's definitely one thing that our group is going to be looking at together with a number of tribal partners. And I actually like to emphasize that it's really been a number of the Tribal Treaty Authority organizations or kind of resource management organizations that have been real leaders in understanding potential climate change impacts on Manoomin, and actually just various important beings, important species, I guess we can also say. I think maybe there are people standing by with some resources that they can share with the group, but I know that, yeah, there's a number of tribal organizations, and these have really been the foundation of what we're trying to understand. I mean, Manoomin wild rice is very sensitive to fluctuations in water levels, and so this is very directly driven by climate. It's very sensitive to temperatures. Interestingly, it's been noted to us that it's probably actually winter temperatures, and that there's been a lot of observations that there's going to be a good crop after a hard freeze. And so, you know, winters are obviously getting warmer, and so that can be a threat. And just other things. I mean, I think one thing that's really struck me about just how really thorough the assessment was in some of these reports is that, you know, I think a lot of times we think climate change, well, that's warming, right? So that's the one direct thing. But in a lot of these reports, there's really careful thinking about, well, it's going to propagate through many other aspects of the system, right? Like, is higher temperatures and humidity maybe going to affect, you know, disease, maybe fungal diseases? You know, is it going to be affecting other animals that interact with Manoomin? And so I think that's really coming back again to kind of what Tiana was talking about in terms of, you know, a holistic understanding. I think that's the really tough thing about climate change. It's not just going to be just one variable affecting just Manoomin. It's going to be the whole system.
I think also, you know, to kind of follow up on that, Crystal, a little bit, that, you know, climate change, I think, is not just, like you said, global warming. It's many things, but I think it also is, it creates a lot of extremes. We're seeing more record high temperatures. We're seeing more record low temperatures. We're seeing higher levels of rain. We're seeing drought in other areas. So when we talk about the Manoomin as being sensitive plant to many different elements, when we start looking at these extremes, that's I think is going to be a real issue for the survival of the wild rice.
Oh yeah, Chris, go.
Yeah, I was just gonna, from my, you know, the perspective that I've contributed to this work on, I think another real threat to wild rice, and something I've already mentioned and that, you know, you talked at length about just a few minutes ago there, Mike, was about just not being aware of what wild rice or Manoomin means to the people who rely on it. I mean, it's not just, you know, that was the first thing that I really worked to ingrain into my head when I started with this work, is it's not just a plant, it's a living relative, it's a living, breathing being. And not being aware of that leads to, like you were talking about, Mike, these damaging kind of research initiatives that maybe start off with good intentions, but end up doing things like, you know, something that I highlighted was, you know, I think 1965, I'm just throwing out numbers, you could, you know, a pound of wild rice sold for $30 on the market. By 1973, it was $10 or something like that. So taking away that ability for these communities to provide for themselves through that, you know, wild rice being one of those avenues, as well as the fact that, you know, we have certain laws here in Minnesota and in the US that, you know, restrict how people, you know, maybe work with genetics on plants, or, you know, we have labeling laws here in Minnesota. You have to label, if it's paddy rice, it has to be labeled as such. It can't be labeled as, you know, it can't be misleading to, but wild rice exists also outside of the US. It's been taken out of the Great Lakes region and in other areas of the world. And, you know, maybe I would hope that knowledge of that importance that wild rice has to the communities that it belongs to would be something that might stop or make somebody think about what they're doing before they do something worse than what we've seen so far in terms of possibly genetics or some other market manipulation or something like that that can cause further harm to these communities.
I will keep it brief because you all addressed it very well, but just understanding the public's need to know this information, especially if you're in these areas, being aware of these rights, being aware of the issues, and starting at a young age for young school children to understand the science, that they are scientists, especially in Native kids, learning that, all right, here is the scientific numbers that the hydrologist has, but then making sure to make space for the knowledge keepers to come in and say, yes, and here's the oral history and the tradition and our way of knowing that, like you said, a hard winter is going to yield this, and to translate those numbers and to work together to bring that information out, and just understanding that it changes year to year, and that when we talk about climate change, that we, the people, are a part of it, and we are instrumental in making sure that we change that narrative, and to make sure that that data is protected and empowered, and making sure that due diligence is done. And just thinking about when I entered into the environmental justice and public memory course, I had shared that within our own community, because of the deforestation along our creeks, we were losing just very important medicines for us, losing those relatives. So putting in that framework of that, we're threatened, our relatives are threatened, putting it in a different framework of, oh, this natural resource, not just a natural resource, but to really give it the humanity it deserves, as it played in a very important role, still continues to do so. So just to hopefully get past just treating it as just an object, and get us to a point of what are we doing, and making those plans and making sure we stick with them. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to contribute. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. I think one of the things we hear a lot from our tribal partners is that we need to understand this relationship that us as humans have with wild rice, both understanding from the tribal perspective, but also forming our own relationships amongst each other, as well as with the wild rice itself. And that's a key in sustainability, or a key for us to really protect and restore wild rice. And that's a threat. If we don't have people that are ricing, both native and non-native, if we don't have people that know how to I don't know, manage the landscape around wild rice waters, that's a real threat. And so one of the things we did that was really interesting is we did a survey with all the wild rice harvesting permit holders in the state of Minnesota. So we worked with the DNR, and we got the list and sent surveys out to folks to ask how their impressions, how is wild rice changing across the landscape? Because it is really a little bit unclear. And wild rice, it seems that over time, it does have a cyclical kind of up and down way of being. And the responses we got back, so these are mostly non-native harvesters, 1,200 or so in the state of Minnesota, but not all. So if I go wild ricing, I need a permit, so I would be on that list as well. But mostly non-native harvesters, and the passion that people had for wild rice, and the same thing that we're talking about now, the need for knowledge about how do we protect the waters, how do we teach younger folks how to do this. It was really, really heartening. And I think all of that coming together can help us move forward with protecting our wild rice ecosystems and habitats. Okay, now there are lots of questions and they're great. So I'm going to try to bring in some audience questions at this point. There have been a number, so hopefully I do them justice. Now, if you want to add more questions, just put them in the queue as well, because we'll start taking them. Let's see. I should have picked it first.
Mike, while you're
Yeah.
kind of looking at this,
Yeah,
I did notice that there was a question a little bit earlier about training, if we were offering any training and things like that. And so so this is kind of a question to you, because before I retired from the university, you and I had been on a university-wide committee in which we created a document, a policy, a procedure on working with tribal nations, specifically with the Manoomin. And as I was leaving, I think it was finally at the president's desk. Can you maybe tell me, has it been finalized? Has it been approved? Has maybe just tell us a little bit about what that was all about.
okay, so Mark is mentioning something that we brought together at the beginning of our project, and we called it a research protocol. So this is something that we as a research team wanted to develop with our tribal partners. It was something that came out in our earliest listening, when we were listening to people, as Mark was saying, that data sovereignty, the sovereignty of tribal knowledge, was of utmost importance to our tribal partners. And so we went about looking at different examples across the country, listening, back and forth writing. We developed protocols for doing research. Some of the protocol says things like research done on tribal lands are completely within the sovereignty of the tribe. That data is tribal data. If there's any sort of concern about university having that data, that it will never, funding won't go towards it. We won't have the data on our computers, that kind of thing. Research done in ceded territories. We really discussed having this as a collaborative, as equals. Nobody publishes it without everybody being in agreement. The tribes have equal access to the data. We make sure that they all have that as well. And one of the things I'll say here, this might be a little bit of an aside, but the idea of, when we brought this to some of the university lawyers, just to try to say, hey, how do we sign these kind of protocols? So we're developing this protocol. We'd like the university to sign it. This is what we're bound by. And there really wasn't a mechanism for that, for the university to be signing these types of research protocols. I said, well, what about, private industry, right? University has all sorts of agreements with private industry. Well, this is a little bit different. And so it was hard to find that, find exactly where the university, there wasn't a precedent for it at the university level. And so one of the things that was really stressed by the university is that they want to protect our academic freedom as researchers, right? That's a key concept in universities, academic freedom, right? And it's a good one. It's a good and important concept. But when I think about it a little bit, it's when we're saying we're not going to publish data without tribal agreement, that's just what we do as research scientists anyway. If I'm on a team working with people, I'm not going to publish a paper with Crystal if Crystal's not in agreement with what we're saying in that paper. And we bring our tribal partners in as equals and co-authors on things. So in a sense, we probably, if we were ethical, and I think we are, we wouldn't be publishing stuff that what the tribes weren't in agreement anyway. So we developed these protocols. The university then, as Mark mentioned, said, these are pretty good. Let's try to think about university-wide protocols for wild rice research. That happened before the current president is in, and it sort of stalled out in the transition. I can't speak to exactly what's happening with the wild rice research protocol, but I can say that the university has been making a lot of strides to improve relationships with the tribes here in the state. And wild rice is certainly something that the tribes, as I've mentioned before, are very interested in talking about and getting the university to sort of understand their perspectives. So these are discussions that are ongoing. I'm very optimistic about where the university is right now. Currently, they're advertising for a person that advises the president, so directly reporting to the university president on tribal relations. There's another person in that upper sort of echelon as well, that reports to a vice president, and we're seeing the university make a lot of strides in to support tribal sovereignty. So the federal government has protocols for consulting with tribes. Every federal agency that came out, I think, under the Obama administration, and it's been maintained. The state as well every state agency needs to have tribal consultation policy. But the university doesn't really have that. For me, I think that's one of the next steps that we can make as a university. How do we consult with tribes? What are we going to do? And I have a feeling that's going to be coming with these new hires. Okay, that was a good one. And of course, now I'm talking again. So that was the question though, Mark. That was one that I was going to ask. Let's see. So there's questions about land. Couple questions about what would help. I think these are more of a comment that that in order to support Indigenous and Black folks is that there needs to be active consent and consistent work of anti-racism. I think we're all in agreement with that one. There's a question about what's being done to give Indigenous back their land. That's sort of beyond the scope, but I know that, for example, up on the Leech Lake Reservation, the U.S. Forest Service this last year gave back, I think it was 12,000 acres. That's unprecedented. I think we're going to look to that Leech Lake Reservation and the Chippewa National Forest as models for how to manage federal lands in partnership with tribes moving forward. So that's something to keep an eye on. There's one comment on that the university and nobody's making genetically modified rice. I think I'll reiterate that and just say that the work that's been done is characterizing the genes, so the genome part of that. So we didn't want to give the impression that someone's making genetically modified rice. Let's see, what else? Somebody help me now, actually. Can you all see the questions too? So there's a question about interest into some sort of I don't know the exact bill they're talking about, but a Truth and Healing Commission around boarding schools. The university, again, we're setting up a commission right now as we speak that essentially is going to look at, it's going to be kind of like a truth finding committee that will dig into all of the various aspects of the university's work with tribes and research. Wild rice is one of them. Land is some of them. If you look in the Star Tribune a week or so ago, there were 2 articles on that. You can read that. Some good questions. Okay, I'm going to scroll all the way down. I'm going to need some help here, actually. Jenny, maybe if you could unmute and help me ask these, because I'm having a hard time doing it on this fly here.
Mark, did you start to unmute yourself to answer one of the questions?
I was just going to, looking down on the list here, there was a question, as a mother and educator, I was asking about how we bridge, share deeper understanding around the Manoomin with our younger students. And again, I think it's just a question of, but what I would encourage you to do is kind of think about how do you integrate that knowledge? So as a teacher and educator, what are you teaching? And then how can you bring in the views, not just Indigenous views, but other views. There's other cultural views of things as well. And so I had one educator I was working with one time who they were so excited because they were doing both Indigenous stuff and science stuff. And I went in and set it on their class. And so for the class, sorry, my phone started ringing. Anyway, they started talking about science, and then they abruptly stopped and said, now we'll talk about culture. It's like, no, integrate them. You know, what is the intersection between this cultural knowledge and this science knowledge? How can you include it or incorporate those things? So that's one thing I, helping, young people understand that it's not, indigenous science and Western science are not, it's science. They can be integrated. Why can't we learn both?
Okay, I'm back on track here. Here's a question. As a non-tribal person who enjoys eating and cooking with wild rice, what practices could I observe to help sustain it? Purchase only from certain resources? Choose not to eat so as not to create demand? What should I do?
Just real quickly, the thing I always tell people to do is the two resources that I know where you can buy directly from tribal communities is whiteearth.com or Red Lake Foods, or I think it's Red Lake Nation Foods or Red Lake Foods. You can buy rice directly from the tribes, and that's a piece of advice I always give if people want to support the communities instead of big business or whatever that's using the paddy rice.
Leech Lake has a website as well.
Yeah, I would say you have to do your own homework, and you have to invest the time to find that information. A lot is out there, and oftentimes I would say be cautious about bombarding these folks who work with wild rice and the tribes. Make sure you research and address the basic questions. And that's the beautiful point of this exhibit. It gives the foundational knowledge about the history, and resources are available to you all, and to make sure that you're not coming and approaching in an exploitative way. And yeah, just do your homework, come in a good way, and don't be afraid to extend that information that you learn to others, because that's what it's there for. It's to have a conversation, and it's beautiful that the interest is there, and to just continue that momentum. We live in the age of Google, right? But sometimes you do have to put in some work and take that time to research for yourself. But that's the beautiful thing of this exhibit, is that it's there at your fingertips, and a lot of folks have done the work for us. So that is wonderful. Can be a lifelong learner when it comes to this, and that not all the answers are going to be available right away, but just to be gracious and take that time.
Mike, I also noticed another one here, which I think is, especially for the university, is important. Asking the question about, faculty have academic freedom. They have the rights to research the things that are of their interest. And essentially what the person is asking is, how do you balance that against the sovereign rights of the nation? What if there's a research project that you want to do that maybe is not in being embraced by the tribal community and the sovereignty? Do we have the right to just go forward with that research, or does the tribe, can they just say, oh, you're not going to do it? I'll just throw that out for the others. I don't know, my opinion is that you don't do it. It's not your knowledge, it's not your land. You just don't do the research.
Yeah, I was looking at that question too, and I have two thoughts. One is that I'm guessing that most on this call, we are settlers here, and we have enjoyed great benefits from being here, and we should reflect on that. and reflect when a sovereign nation asks us not to do something. I think that's one thing. I think a second, sorry, Mike, were you gonna, okay. A second is I know that one thing that was really powerful for me and for a lot of us, a lot of other conventionally trained scientists like myself, non-native on our project, was hearing a Native person describe how it felt to have research done on wild rice in a way that was not respectful. And I don't share that cultural background. I did not grow up understanding Manoomin as a sacred being. But when you hear someone describe it and say, Manoomin is a relative for me, it's like my grandmother. I've heard that. I've heard, it's a relative. I think we can all relate to, we wouldn't want some sort of research or test done on, I don't want that done on my grandmother. So maybe I don't understand exactly what it feels like to have that relationship with Manoomin, but I can hear it. And, I was very fortunate to actually, to be, at an event where I could hear, Native people talking about this. It was actually a conference that Mark has played a really major role in organizing and bringing together university researchers and tribal community members. But there's really, that's one of the great things about the internet, right? The Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, I believe, maybe also 1854 Treaty Authority, their websites, they've done interviews. They've done interviews with tribal community members. I think there was also a question of like, well, maybe I don't have access to, and we shouldn't constantly be bugging, tribal members to tell us over and over again how things feel for them. Those resources are out there. So I think just some reflection about, the privileges that I and many of you as settlers have, that, and also just listening and just the humanity that we have when we communicate with each other, when we hear directly from each other. I think that the answer might be there for that question.
Oh, yep. So I would like to add that what is it worth for you and your reputation and your work you may have done previously? Is it worth the cost of having your work basically be invalidated because you felt entitled to it and pushed your way forward? I don't think in any line of research that is acceptable at a scholarly standard. And thankfully, I believe for the most part, at least for the university, because of the advocates and how hard people have pushed at the table to have these barriers in place, to have these reflection checkpoints, like Crystal pointed out, just because sometimes it's done with the most greatest intentions and without the intent to harm, but ultimately, thank goodness for checkpoints. It helps to really get down to what you want, researchers want to know. What do you really want to achieve by this? Do you just want those letters behind your name and to feel like an authority over a topic? Or are you really trying to contribute to the collective research done on this? Because the collective research that's currently being done would not accept this and invalidate that. So just to make sure that those checkpoints are there to reframe it. And that's the point of being in college and universities, is not to be continuously learning. So making sure that you take that time to accept the no and just reevaluate your intentions.
I've been thinking a lot about academic freedom in relation to this, and I'm coming to my own ideas here that hopefully they make sense and they can help all of us move forward. But it has to do with these institutional review boards that we have. Universities have them for human subjects research. Some tribes have them for human subjects, but also, like Mark mentioned, for example, the White Earth tribe has a review board for all research that's going to happen with White Earth people on their lands. And I think if we have more of those tribal institutional review boards, essentially reviewing proposals with clear guidance up front So there needs to be some work with that so that projects can be looked at, and there's criteria that the researchers understand, and then have a process, because we're not allowed to do any sort of research we want with human subjects. That's these review boards were set up for that manner. It doesn't infringe upon academic freedom. I can't shock people in my experiment. That was one of them that they stopped and formed these institutional review boards for. So the same thing, if we start looking at tribal interests, it seems to me like we can have institutional review board. And the idea with that too, as you heard from Mark, it's a back and forth dialogue that then produces a better research project that not only helps science, but also supports community and what the tribal community would like to see out of it. Okay, a couple quick questions and then we're getting to the end here, but somebody wanted to mention the National Museum of the American Indian has a cookbook. So I encourage people to check that out. I haven't seen it yet. I know there's a lot of native cookbooks around. Dream of Wild Health has one you can get as well. So that's great. Here's just kind of a short one, maybe some short answers on this, but how do you maintain and nourish these partnerships as research team shifts, as people come in and out?
Yeah, well, I think that sometimes, it seems like we just have a lot of meetings and it can be really overwhelming, but I think just having that continuity by making sure we get together and we just communicate and pass down that information. I don't think it's always easy, but I think that's how we do it. It's relationships. It's what we all know how to do for how to maintain relationships. It's communication.
Okay, I'll ask another one. There's several people that are talking about this idea of is no breeding for wild rice acceptable to tribes? So I wonder if anyone can give that one, and also the economic sort of question about if you breed rice, it's an economic thing.
I think like most plants, the Manoomin change is constantly being changed, and that these breeding programs maybe enhance or have those changes happen a little bit more quickly. I think if you're doing some breeding programs in conjunction with the tribes, I think from my understanding and from the conversations I've had with some of the tribal folks is that if you're trying to breed the rice to become more standard grain, more standard size, so it's more easily cultivated, so it can be economic crop, probably not so much. But we do understand that certain that to
You're kind of breaking up there, Mark.
another area, it doesn't work.
Okay, Mark,
And
you're
so
you're breaking up. So I suggest, I don't know if you can hear me. Jenny, maybe can you mute him? Because he's, okay, sorry about that. We're getting to the end here. I'm going to ask one final question, but I'll put this thought out there, that if research we're doing is respectful and addressing tribal goals around wild rice, then I think things are on the table, right? But if the research is done without regard for tribal partnership or tribal goals, then that's a problem. That's appropriating a cultural plant. It wasn't just here for the university to come and find and improve, right? Tribes have had relationships, and I'll stress Dakota and Ojibwe communities and other native nations in this region have had deep relationships with this plant And that if we do research as a university without regard to that relationship, we're not doing justice to the tribes. We're perpetuating a system that marginalizes Indigenous voices. And that kind of gets us back to where we started. Now, that's kind of heavy, and it is heavy stuff, but I want to ask for the final, just maybe take 1 minute or less, what are your hopes for the future?
I can just go real quick. I think just less resistance or more willingness to meet people in the middle or understand where people are coming from. Again, a lot of my work on this project has focused on kind of trying to make people more aware about cultural significances and as well as damages done that the university has perpetuated and contextualizing the seriousness of those damages. So again, to reiterate, less resistance or more willingness to meet people where they're at.
I would just mention, Mike, because you mentioned earlier about the university making great strides. Just hope that the future that continues. 25 years of working with the university, I'm glad to hear that it's finally paying off.
I just want to say really quick that this panel makes me feel hopeful. Just hearing how Mark described how things were so difficult when he was doing a lot of this work to now we have Tiana and Chris. And Tiana, thank you so much for doing that translation work and helping us understand. And Chris, thanks for you being a grad student and already thinking about these things that it took me way longer in my career. And I think if we can just continue this communication and this learning together, I actually feel really hopeful.
I agree. Honored and just learned a lot today from you all, and that for the future, I would like to see continued collaboration, and I believe just consistency and just doing everything in earnest and just continuing to build lasting partnerships.
Miigwech, everyone. I would like to thank you all and pass it back to Jenny here.
I also would like to thank you all. This was a great discussion, and we really appreciate your perspectives on this important question of building productive partnerships. Especially appreciate the opportunity to hear from a diverse set of Indigenous people. So some people who joined us later may not have heard that Mike, Mark, and Tiana are all from different tribes and can speak to this experience differently. So I just want to flag that as we go out. I want to thank the audience for joining us tonight. We will post a version of this video on our website, along with some resources. These are really complicated questions, some history that we didn't get to, and some of you are interested in digging into that, and we want to support you in that. So we will have some resources available for you. I also just want to say, I hope folks will join us for our next event in this series, a panel discussion on environmental justice and transportation corridor planning. That's coming up on Wednesday, May 5th. And we're looking forward to that. Please join us for that. And again, one last hearty thank you to our panelists. We appreciate your time. Thank you, Mike, for moderating tonight. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.